Welcome to Social Studies with Miss Rogers, World History Edition. The treaty is signed, kind of, and World War I is officially over. The world doesn't know it at the time, but conditions for World War II are already in the works. In what we call the interwar period, we're gonna see how various nations around the world are being groomed by new political leaders and new dictators to strike back and retaliate against what they consider unfairness from World War I. So, let's get started. We remember that many nations left the Paris peace talks very frustrated, especially nations such as Italy and Germany. Italy thought they deserved way more than they received from the Central Powers, and Germany thought they really got screwed over. The Germans were furious with their punishments, and many Germans were still angry that their country surrendered in the first place. For a while, it did seem like life would go on. Nations started to rebuild, we see a new normal as economically more countries around the world start to rely on the United States, and all is grand until it just isn't. The stock market crash, aka the beginning of the Great Depression in America, is gonna have a domino effect that provides the perfect conditions for World War II. You see, as many countries rely on America economically, the rest of the world also feels this depression. And the desperation that many nations feel during this crisis will create the atmosphere needed for certain leaders to come to power and also for the beginning rumblings of World War II. When we look at the underlying causes of World War II, many concepts on this list already look familiar. We see nationalism, militarism, imperialism, isolationism can be argued to be a cause of World War II, but some new terms we see are fascism and totalitarian dictatorships. Let's start with fascism. Fascism is a new militant political movement that emphasized on loyalty to the state and obedience to its leader. Most fascists share several ideas. They preach an extreme form of nationalism or loyalty to one's country, not the good and unifying kind, usually the, hey, we deserve more than everyone else because we're the best kind of nationalism. Fascists believe that nations must struggle and that they should always be looking to war, always be looking to take over, and always be looking to expand, because to fascists, peaceful states are doomed to just be conquered. You have to be threatening so that you don't look like a target. Fascists also pledge loyalty to an authoritarian leader who guided and brought order to the state. They're required to appreciate such a leader. And in some nations, fascists wore uniforms of a certain color, used special salutes, held mass rallies, anything to identify, hey, this person is a part of our super special group. In some ways, fascism can be similar to communism. Both systems are ruled by dictators who only allow their political party to exist. Both deny people individual rights. In both, the state is supreme, and neither practice any kind of democracy or democratic ideas. However, unlike communists, fascists don't seek a classless society. Instead, fascists believe that each class has its own place and function. Fascists were nationalists. Communists were internationalists, hoping to unite workers worldwide. And again, even though fascism does have some similarities to communism, fascists typically promote anti-communist ideas, and by that I mean targeting and attacking communists in the streets. Fascists and communists typically do not like each other. And one last thing before we move on from fascism. Fascism is sometimes viewed as a right-wing idea and concept, but it really isn't. If you're looking at an economic spectrum where you would have communism, which is a radical form of socialism, on the far left, and on the far right you would have a complete free market with no regulation at all. Fascism doesn't really fit on either side. They see themselves as separate. The idea of right and left really have to do with economic systems, and fascism is not an economic system. It's about nationalism and your nationality. Real fascists and nationalists see themselves in a different way. Everything is lesser than the state. Now, if they had to choose, fascists would usually align themselves with more of the right end of the spectrum because remember, they are anti-socialism and anti-communism. But again, in its purest form, fascism does not see itself as right or left because it's about nationality, not economics. Everything is lesser than the state. There should only be one party with one strong leader at the top, which leads to this idea of a totalitarian rule and dictators. Think of totalitarian dictators like absolute rulers in a way. The term totalitarian describes a government that takes total centralized state control over every aspect of life, both public and private. Totalitarian leaders appear to provide a sense of security and give a direction for the future of their nation. Often, these leaders utilize secret police to crush opposition and create a sense of fear among people so that they feel like they need this leader. No one is exempt from suspicion or accusations that they could be the enemy of the state. Everyone is suspicious. Everyone could be a threat, and they need this leader to show them the truth. Totalitarianism challenges ideas such as reason, freedom, human dignity, and the worth of the individual. It goes against every single social movement that we've looked at this year. To dominate the entire nation, totalitarian leaders typically use methods of control and persuasion. They include fear, terror, indoctrination, propaganda, censorship, even religious and ethnic persecution, getting rid of people who don't fit their mold. We're gonna see fascism and/or totalitarian dictatorships take over some areas of both Europe and Asia this unit. So, let's start with Russia, since their issues started first. We mentioned in previous classes that Russia struggled with both a revolution and a civil war. And today we're going to explain what happened so that you can see how that will connect to World War II. Before World War I, the czars, or leaders of Russia, were afraid that enlightened ideas would promote change. The kind of change that would take their precious power away. And, we cannot have that. So czars said, no way, no questioning my authority. You must worship within the Russian Orthodox Church. The Russian language is the language of our lands. Anyone else is a danger to our nation. Jews were one major target of Tsar Alexander II, and when Tsar Nicholas Romanov came to power, he continued these practices. Nicholas is actually the Tsar who entered Russia into World War I. We know that Russia was not as industrialized as her allies or even her enemies, so we know that Russia was seriously lacking resources. Some soldiers would be sent into war without bullets, some without shoes. If you think that sounds crazy just listening to that in our class, just think about how these soldiers felt when they were like, hey, here's your gun. I don't really have bullets for you, but have fun. Go get the Germans. Go get the Central Powers. How do you think their loved ones felt watching them go off to war with rags on their feet instead of shoes? Because the Russians could not mass produce the kind of resources that they needed. Not only that, but working conditions back home were not great either, and this caused many people back on the home front to become very discontent. A group of people that followed the ideas of Karl Marx established a following that grew until it kind of split in two. You had moderates on one side that called themselves the Mensheviks, and the radicals on the other side who called themselves the Bolsheviks. Bolsheviks wanted radical change and were willing to sacrifice anything to get it. Though unlike Karl Marx, Bolsheviks thought a group of elites should lead a revolution, not common people like Marx did. The leader of the Bolsheviks, named Vladimir Lenin, fled to Western Europe when the Tsar tried to have him arrested, because remember, we cannot disagree with the Tsars. As conditions worsened in Russia, eventually Tsar Nicholas was not only forced to abdicate, but a year later, he and his entire family were executed. But instead of just giving up on the war right then and there, the Russian government scrambled to establish a new normal so they could continue with this war. The Germans believed that stirring up a revolution would further weaken Russia's standing in World War I, so they actually arranged to have Lenin sent back to Russia. When Lenin returned, he started preaching things like peace, bread, and land, things that he promised to give to the Russian people, and when the time was right, he decided to take action. Lenin truly believed the only way to have a real revolution was through violence. He didn't believe in peace talks or negotiating or anything civil like that. The Bolsheviks did forcefully take over, getting rid of any glimpse of political opposition and forcing their way to total control. Lenin ordered factories to be controlled by the workers, for farmland to be distributed to the peasant farmers, and for peace talks to begin with Germany to pull Russia out of the war. And it was a lot to tackle at once, but the grind did not stop there. Because not everyone agreed with Lenin, his ideas, or his tactics, Russia would break out into a civil war, those who supported Lenin and the Bolsheviks, and those who didn't. Lenin's Red Army won the Civil War, even with the United States sending troops to the opposing army. And what it did was show that the Bolsheviks could not only take power, but maintain it. Lenin continued to lead Russia and saw nationalism as a dangerous threat to loyalty and unity. So he organized Russia into several self-governing republics under one central government. And in 1922, the country was renamed the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the USSR. Then, the Bolsheviks renamed their party the Communist Party, and they had all of the power in the land. Lenin had established a dictatorship of the Communist Party, which was a little bit different than the idea of communism that Karl Marx promoted. Life continued on this way until Vladimir Lenin had a stroke. He did survive, but it made him look weak and provided the conditions for a man named Joseph Stalin to come to power. Joseph Stalin was a man that even Vladimir Lenin considered dangerous, cold, hard, and impersonal. By 1928, he was in total command of the Communist Party, and the next year he would take his place as dictator. It was Joseph Stalin who truly changed Russia into a totalitarian dictatorship. Stalin employed thousands of men into his government and placed the blame for hardships such as food scarcity on peasants, using them as their scapegoat. Stalin claimed peasants were hiding food from the government because they were greedy, and it actually unified everyone together under Stalin's rule against the soulless and almost inhuman peasants. Poor people were Stalin's scapegoat for all of the hardships that Russian people faced, and we're going to talk a little bit more about scapegoats when we get to Germany. Italy, on the other hand, would see a rise in fascism, not communism. We know that Italy was a part of the Allies in World War I, and they were supposed to be a major player in the Paris peace talks. But we also know they did not gain nearly as much as they thought they would after World War I in terms of territory, and that made them very mad. On top of that, thanks to the global economic crisis, many Italians were struggling heavily. As time went on and conditions worsened, Italians began believing that their government was too weak to be able to help their people, and they started demanding a strong leader who would do something to help living conditions improve. This was where Benito Mussolini came in, promising to restore Italy's greatness, promising to fix economic problems, promising to restore Italy's pride. Mussolini did use Russia as an example and used communism to make himself more popular. Remember, fascists hate communists. See, look at Russia! Completely fell to the communists. Now they're the USSR. This is why you need a strong ruler. This is why you need me to keep that from happening to our lands. This scared a lot of people, and eventually a group known as the Black Shirts started targeting communists and socialists in the middle of the streets, just attacking them for no reason. As conditions worsened in Italy, Mussolini became more and more popular, and eventually the Italians feel the need to march on Rome and demand a stronger government. The King of Italy at the time appoints Mussolini as prime minister because he feels threatened by this mob and thinks, hey, maybe this guy will save our nation, I don't know, and proceeded to legally give Mussolini the ability to come to power and gain his dictatorship on his own in a complete legal way. Finally, we have Germany in the rise of both Hitler and the Nazi Party. In World War I, we remember that Germany had its own little overthrow of Kaiser Wilhelm, and the new leaders signed an armistice with the French to stop the fighting and lead to a surrender. And Hitler, who was a soldier in the war, saw those who wanted to stop the fighting as traitors, as did many other Germans at the time. Hitler and many other people came to the conclusion that these civilians ruined Germany and that they had no idea what they were doing. They were being influenced by external factors such as Jews who lived in Germany as a plot to destroy Germany. Now, was this real? No, not at all. But you know yourself that when you're really angry about something that you don't understand, for example, maybe your significant other broke up with you and you're just so angry, so upset, you don't get why. You come up with all of these justifications. Well, maybe they don't mean it. Maybe their friends are a bad influence. Maybe it was that person that they told me not to worry about. Maybe they influenced them. You just try to rationalize it in your brain because you don't understand why someone would act this way. And this is kind of what happened here. Just like in Russia, there are still a lot of feelings against anyone who's not Christian, and Jews are seen as, gross, in a lot of places by a lot of people, and this is just one example. This is what makes sense to Hitler. It must be those Jews. They have forced civilians because no way a real German would do something so stupid on their own. Hitler and people with a similar mindset truly believed that Germany would have won the war if only we didn't sign the stupid armistice. We already know that with the addition of the US troops, that would not have happened. But these Germans really believed it, and they called those who called for the armistice the November criminals. After the war, Hitler is assigned to spy on the German Workers' Party, which is a very nationalistic group. And as he's spying on them, he's finding he really likes a lot of what they have to say. They're anti-Semitic, which is anti-Jewish. They're anti-communist, they're anti-capitalist. They blame the World War I loss on the November criminals. This political group have such strong nationalistic views that they start to see their nationality as their race. And just so you know, that's not how it works. The place you were born or the place that you live does not determine the color of your skin, which is your race. Just to make sure we're all on the same page, but that is truly what these people thought. The concept of nationality and race began to blur into one idea. Even though that's not correct, it's just like how in America, the concepts of democracy and republic have blurred into one idea. Hitler decides to officially join this group because he really likes what they have to say, and this group renames themselves from the German Workers' Party to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi for short. The way this party name would be pronounced in German, the term nationalist is where the nickname Nazi comes from. So now we have the Nazi Party, where Hitler is identified as someone with excellent speaking skills and people skills. Hitler is promoted to chairman of the Nazi Party, and he starts preaching about the Aryan race. Pause, because this whole idea come up with about the Aryan race is very complicated and can be very confusing. So I'm gonna try and make this as simple as possible. And for the record, the historical linguistics that this idea is based on is still just a hypothesis. It's still not proven, and it might never be able to be proven. A couple hundred years ago, it was suggested that all languages of Europe and parts of the Middle East were all variations of one Indo-European language. You remember how in the Middle Ages we talked about how modern Romance languages are all Latin with variations of different Germanic tribes? Like that, but on a much larger scale, and every new language afterwards would just be more and more variations. We talked way back in ancient civilizations and religions about the Aryan people, some of the oldest known people in the world, and the Sanskrit texts from Hinduism name these people a lot as some of the oldest groups of people of the world. So the name for original people, language, culture, everything of Indo-Europe was referred to as Aryan as these ideas about the original Indo-European languages and cultures came up. These are pretty complex ideas, so it's okay if it's a little bit confusing, and don't forget to ask me questions if you have them. But this concept at the time led to some very interesting ideas. And before I repeat these ideas that were thrown around at the time, you have to remember the culture. There's a lot of nationalism in the world. There's a lot of racism in the world. There's a lot of anti-Semitic feelings. And these ideas validated a lot of people's opinions, which is why they liked these ideas so much. So, here's what a lot of people came up with. Maybe the original Aryans were white people who migrated and populated a lot of different areas of the world. Maybe a group of Aryans did take their culture to India, but integrated with the black population of the area, and that's where brown skin comes from. Maybe, since we European white people come from the pure Aryan bloodlines, we should take the swastika, which is an ancient Hindu symbol for good luck and good fortune, and we should use it to represent our true heritage of the Aryan people. Maybe you can tell which people in Europe are pure Aryans and who are not, based off of how light and white their skin is. Maybe even Christianity has nothing to do with the Old Testament and Judaism, because Judaism does not come from the Aryans. Maybe Christianity comes from Germanic paganism because they were Aryans, so clearly that must be where Christianity comes from. And if that is correct, then the idea that Christianity and Judaism are connected is just a conspiracy by Jewish people who want to ruin us. But we as Aryans, the direct descendants of the original inhabitants of the world, deserve to expand because we are the originals, and you can tell by our white skin and light hair. Is some of this making a little bit more sense now? As awful as it sounds, they truly believed that white skin, blonde hair, blue eyes, all recessive traits were proof that you were a pure Aryan that wasn't tainted by inferior DNA. Does that clear some things up as to where their mindset was? As terrible and as wrong as they were, this was what they thought. And this was a popular idea, not necessarily one created by Hitler, but one he took and ran with. And because nationalism is so popular, it's natural for the Germans to assume that they are direct descendants of the pure Aryan race, because who else would be other than them? Nationalism. So Hitler is preaching and gaining support and followers, and eventually the Nazis take a note from Benito Mussolini, someone Hitler does look up to, and they decide just as the Italians marched on Rome, they would march on Munich. But it did not work for them the same way that it worked for Mussolini, and Hitler was arrested for treason. While in jail, Hitler wrote Mein Kampf, translating to My Struggle, where he writes all of his beliefs about the Aryan race, how the Treaty of Versailles was insanely unfair, how Germany not only needed but deserved more Lebensraum or living space because they were overcrowded, and as the Aryan race, it was their right to expand their territory. It's also in Mein Kampf that he identifies the Jews as the racial impurities within both Germany and the world. How all problems Germany is facing comes from both Jewish impurity and conspiracy against the Germans. The Jews are keeping the Germans from reaching their full potential. The Jews wanted us to lose World War I. The Jews are why we are now so poor. The Jews are why we are hungry. The Jews are constantly plotting against us because they are jealous of our Aryan superiority and supremacy, and therefore, they want our downfall, and we must destroy them if we are ever going to get Germany back on her feet again. We are allowing our nation to be tainted with inferior people, inferior DNA, and this is why we were not good enough to win World War I. We must fix this problem before the plague that is Judaism costs us more than we've already lost. This was his book. This is what he preached. This is what he wrote while he was in jail. So Hitler gets out of jail and continues to drum up support, but most of Germany ignores him. Germany's recovering from war. They're trying to move on with their lives, and Germany does okay. Until, those darn Americans! The stock market crash and the Great Depression that impacts the whole world hurts Germany bad. Germans start becoming desperate. Germany was doing okay, but now there's so much more poverty everywhere. People are having trouble affording food for their families. They don't know how to help their loved ones. People are getting sick, and people are just starting to panic. And now everyone starts taking Hitler's words a little bit more seriously. Those reading his book are desperate. They're hungry, they're tired, they're humiliated, and they've been given someone else to blame. You know how if you're ever not doing well in a class and your parents ask why you aren't doing well and you just try to blame your teacher because you think they won't notice? Trust me, we notice. We might not say anything, but we notice. And your parents sometimes believe you because they don't want to believe their perfect child would ever do something wrong. Yeah, you're kind of doing to them what Hitler did to the German people. It happens all the time. You're using the teachers as a scapegoat so you don't have to take responsibility. And you aren't right, but your parents think you are. And they get really angry and they go after the teachers, and it's a whole thing. There are many examples of this kind of thing we could use. Because people love placing the blame for their failures onto other people. Right now, while these Germans are really struggling and they don't know why, they're just angry and looking for a solution, and, well, Hitler gave them one. They're so desperate, a lot of them believe it. Over the years, Hitler and the Nazis continue to gain popularity, continue to gain power, and many political leaders underestimate Hitler and his intelligence. They thought they could use him as a puppet. He had a lot of followers, so leaders in the government convinced the president of Germany to make him chancellor. They thought they could use him. Whew, did Hitler use them? This takes us to the 1933 parliament elections. They could not find a winner for the majority party, so Germany was gonna have to have a second election. And 6 days before that election, the parliament building just so happens to catch on fire. Like, not a small fire, but a blazing, burning the building down to the ground kind of fire. And Hitler said, "Oh no, the communists! Look at what they did! They're trying to start a revolution just like in Russia. Look at what the communists did in Russia to overthrow the government. We cannot allow that here." Wow, doesn't that sound familiar? So Hitler and the Nazis convinced the president to suspend civil liberties, and it really scares people even further. So, surprise, surprise, the Nazis win the parliament election, which then the Nazis in parliament give the Chancellor of Germany, aka Hitler, unlimited legislative powers, which is legally how Hitler gains complete control of Germany, how he legally makes his way to the top. Hitler and the Nazis passed laws that make it illegal to speak out against him, against the rest of the government. He monitored what was taught in schools, said on the radio, said on TV. He created a secret police that would spy on people to find traitors. He wanted complete economic, social, and political control, and he got it all legally. Nazis are the only legal party allowed in Germany at this point, and they have all of the power, meaning Hitler's able to turn his new attention to what he considers the real problem of the nation, those impurities tarnishing her pure Aryan race. These gentlemen we've talked about are not going to be the only new leaders in the world, and are not even going to be the only new dictators we will see. But these three nations we focused on today are going to be a huge catalyst for what comes next as we move closer and closer to World War II. Next class, we're going to continue inching closer and closer and see how far these dictators of the world are willing to test their limits before causing another altercation in the world. So, I'll see you then.